Boar huddled close to the flickering ember, eyes darting between the howling wind outside the cave and the wrinkled hands of the oldest woman in the group. He wondered why she, with her silver-gray hair and arthritic knees, was the one who never left the fire's side. That question opens a window onto one of the most underappreciated survival strategies of the Ice Age: the central role of elders in guarding the flame. Scientists who study Upper Paleolithic sites, such as Grotte du Peyronel in France and the Dolní Vestana settlement in the Czech Republic, have found consistent evidence that fire pits were often located in the deepest, most protected parts of a dwelling, precisely where the oldest members of the band spent most of their time. The reason is practical, not mystical. Maintaining a fire at sub-zero temperatures required constant attention, adding tinder, stoking embers, and shielding the blaze from drafts. A lapse of even a few minutes could let the temperature drop below the critical point where a small fire dies out, leaving the group exposed to hypothermia and predator attacks. Elders, having survived countless winters, possessed the accumulated knowledge of which bark, dry grasses, or fungus species ignited fastest even when damp. Their hands, though shaky, remembered the rhythm of a steady beat to keep sparks alive. Moreover, because they were less likely to be sent on long hunting forays, they could stay near the hearth and act as fire watchers, a role that younger, more mobile members could not fill without jeopardizing the camp's heat source. Anthropologists also point to the social function of elders as teachers. When a child first learned to strike flint, it was the grandparent who demonstrated the proper angle and pressure, turning a dangerous spark into a reliable flame. This transmission of skill reduced the learning curve dramatically, meaning that even in the harshest season, the group could produce new fires without relying on trial and error that might cost lives. There is also a defensive angle. Predators such as wolves and hyenas were deterred by smoke and light. A continuously burning fire created a barrier of scent and glare that kept hungry carnivores at bay. The presence of an experienced elder, capable of reacting swiftly to an unexpected flare-up or a sudden gust, meant the fire could be kept alive long enough to drive off intruders. Finally, the emotional stability provided by elders cannot be ignored. In a world where mortality was a daily certainty, the calm demeanor of a seasoned survivor offered psychological comfort. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies, like the Hadza of Tanzania, show that elder members often serve as mediators, storytellers, and keepers of cultural memory, functions that reinforce group cohesion, which in turn improves overall survival odds. So when Boar watched that ancient grandmother tend the fire, he was witnessing a multi-layered survival system. Practical fire maintenance expertise, intergenerational knowledge transfer, predator deterrence, and social stability, all wrapped into one seemingly simple act of sitting by the hearth. The next time you see a grandparent in a modern living room, remember they are carrying on a lineage that once kept humanity warm against the bitter -40°C winds of the Ice Age. How did Ice Age mothers bring new life into a world where a single night could drop to -40°, where predators roamed the snow-covered tundra, and where there was no sterile clinic, no antibiotics, no ultrasound? The answer lies in a combination of biology, community support, and clever use of the environment. Everything we know comes from the careful work of paleoanthropologists, osteologists, and ethnographers who study both ancient skeletons and the practices of recent hunter-gatherer societies. First, the human body itself is remarkably adapted for birth in cold climates. Women's pelvises are slightly broader than those of earlier hominins, giving a bit more room for the baby's head to pass. Fat deposits in the abdominal area and under the skin act as natural insulation, slowing heat loss during labor. Bone analysis from sites like Dolní Vestana in the Czech Republic shows that many women were in their late teens to early 20s, prime reproductive age, when they gave birth, which reduced the risks associated with older maternal age. But biology only gets you so far. The social network of the group was the real safety net. Archaeologists have uncovered communal hearths surrounded by low-lying stone benches or mammoth bone platforms. These were not just places to cook meat, they served as birthing stations. The heat from the fire created a microclimate that could keep a laboring mother's core temperature stable, while the surrounding stones retained warmth for hours after the flames died down. In some Upper Paleolithic sites, tiny stone beds are arranged in a circle, suggesting that a mother would be positioned on a padded platform of animal hides, surrounded by other women who assisted with massage, encouragement, and the occasional pressure point technique that we see in modern midwifery. What about tools? The Ice Age didn't give mothers a sterile scalpel, but they did have sharp stone blades, flint or obsidian, crafted for cutting meat. These blades were sometimes used to cut the umbilical cord. Cutting the cord within minutes of birth is crucial to prevent hemorrhage, and experimental archaeology shows that a well-made flint blade can do the job cleanly enough to avoid serious infection. In many cases, though, mothers would simply let the cord dry and snap naturally, a method observed in contemporary hunter-gatherer groups living in similar conditions. Pain management was another clever, low-tech solution. Plant knowledge was extensive. Dried moss, willow bark, and even the sap of certain conifers contain mild analgesic compounds. Women would chew or apply these substances to the abdomen to dull the pain. In some sites, residues of pine resin have been found on stone tools, suggesting it may have been used as a topical antiseptic or soothing balm. After the baby emerged, the first priority was keeping it warm. Newborns lose heat faster than adults, and with sub-zero winds outside, hypothermia was a real danger. Mothers would immediately wrap the infant in multiple layers of animal skins, often the same skins used for clothing, creating a makeshift thermal blanket. The communal fire provided a steady source of radiant heat, and the whole group would keep a vigilant eye on the baby, rotating it between the fire's edge and the shelter's interior to avoid overheating or burning. Infection risk was high, but the ancient immune system was surprisingly resilient, especially when the group's diet was rich in omega-3 fatty acids from fish and marine mammals. These nutrients support immune function and reduce inflammation, which would have helped both mother and child fight off bacterial invaders. Moreover, the practice of sharing breast milk within the group, a form of wet nursing, could have provided additional antibodies, a strategy documented among the Inuit and other Arctic peoples today. Finally, the role of elders cannot be overstated. Older women, often post-reproductive, acted as the community's birth mentors. Their experience, passed down through oral tradition, included knowledge of the safest birthing positions, how to recognize signs of complications, and when to call for a helper, usually a younger, physically strong woman who could assist with lifting or repositioning the mother. This intergenerational knowledge transfer is evident in the burial patterns at sites like Lager Velho, where the remains of multiple generations are found together, implying long-term social bonds and shared caregiving responsibilities. So Ice Age childbirth was not a solo, desperate ordeal, but a coordinated, community-driven event. The mother's body, the warmth of the fire, the sharp edge of a flint blade, herbal pain relief, and the collective wisdom of elders, all combined to turn a potentially lethal process into a survivable, even ritualized part of life in the frozen world. How could a Neanderthal keep his belly full when the world outside looked like a frozen desert? The answer isn't just big game, it's a surprisingly diverse menu hidden beneath the ice, and the clues are baked into stone tools, animal bones, and even ancient dental calculus. First, let's picture the landscape. During the height of the last glacial maximum, temperatures in parts of Europe dropped to -30°C, steppe tundra stretched for miles, and the thick permafrost locked away most plant life. Yet Neanderthals didn't starve. Excavations at sites like Vindiga Cave in Croatia and Les Catés in the French Alps reveal cut marks on the bones of reindeer, mammoth, and even the occasional bison. These large herbivores were the obvious staples, and the hunters used robust, flake-based stone points to pierce thick hides and strip meat. But the meat alone wasn't enough, especially during the leanest weeks. Microscopic analysis of dental plaque from Neanderthal remains in Spain shows traces of starch grains from tuberous plants such as wild carrots and underground rhizomes of watercress relatives. These plants grew in microhabitats, nutrient-rich cracks in rock, meltwater streams, and the edges of seasonal thaw pools. When the sun briefly warmed a shallow meltwater pond, a burst of algae and edible macroflora would appear, and Neanderthals were quick to harvest them. Some researchers argue that these, green, resources could have supplied up to 20% of daily calories during the coldest months, a figure supported by stable isotope studies that show a higher proportion of plant-derived carbon in Neanderthal bone collagen than previously thought. Another hidden source was the fat-rich marrow inside the long bones of both large and smaller animals. By cracking open femurs with hammerstones, Neanderthals accessed a calorie-dense ice cream that didn't freeze solid, even at -40. The practice left distinctive percussion, marks that archaeologists can now spot under microscopes. In addition, they collected and ate the brains of freshly killed prey, an especially high-protein, high-fat treat that also provided essential micronutrients like iron and vitamin B12. In coastal regions, where the ice sheet receded, shell middens tell a different story. At the Krapina site in Croatia, tiny fragments of mollusk shells and fish vertebrae indicate that Neanderthals fished through holes in the ice or harvested beach seals. The fatty blubber of these marine mammals supplied crucial omega-3 fatty acids, which modern research links to brain health, perhaps one reason why Neanderthals' brain size was comparable to ours. Finally, let's not forget the opportunistic scavenging of carrion. Bone assemblages at the Goyet Cave in Belgium show that Neanderthals often arrived after wolves had opened a carcass, taking the remaining meat and especially the high-energy organs. This behavior is evident from the pattern of cut marks that avoid the same spots where canine teeth had already gnawed. So, while the icy steppe may have looked barren, Neanderthals turned every crack in the rock, every meltwater pool, and every dead animal into a buffet. Their diet was a clever blend of big game hunting, plant foraging, marrow extraction, and opportunistic scavenging, proof that even in a frozen desert, resourceful humans could find enough food to survive, and perhaps even thrive. How did early humans build sleep-proof shelters to beat -40 degrees? Imagine a night on the steppe when the wind howls like a pack of wolves and the temperature plunges far below the freezing point of water. The only thing between a Paleolithic family and a frozen death was a structure they cobbled together from whatever nature offered, and a deep, instinctive understanding of heat retention that modern engineers are still trying to emulate. The first clue comes from the Ice Age sites in the Altai Mountains in Siberia, where archaeologists have uncovered the remains of semi-subterranean pits cut into permafrost. These pit houses were dug a meter or more deep, then lined with layers of animal hides, moss, and evergreen branches. The earth itself acts as an insulator. Even a shallow trench stays several degrees warmer than the air because the ground retains heat from the sun's daytime radiation. Once the pit was shaped, hunters would lay down a base of packed earth or compacted snow, then spread a thick mat of reindeer or bear skins. The skins were often stitched together with sinew or plant fibers, creating a flexible, waterproof blanket that trapped a thin layer of still air, the best natural insulator we know. Above the pit, a low wooden frame, usually made from spruce or pine branches, supported a thatched roof of split bark, pine needles, and dry grass. The thatch was tightly packed, then sealed with a coating of animal fat mixed with powdered ash. This oily layer repels moisture and reduces heat loss by convection. In some sites, researchers have found evidence of double wall construction, an inner wall of hides and an outer wall of packed earth, with a cavity filled with insulating moss or dried catale stalks. The air trapped in that cavity slows the flow of cold air, much like the double panes of a modern window. Fire was the heart of these shelters. A central hearth, often built on a stone slab to prevent the floor from scorching, provided radiant heat that rose gently, warming the occupants and the surrounding walls. But fire alone isn't enough. The key was to keep the flame burning through the night without exhausting the limited fuel. Early humans learned to store dry wood in sealed pits, wrapped in bark to keep it from absorbing moisture. They also harvested tinder, dry fungus, birch bark, and pine resin, stuffing it into small, portable bundles that could be ignited quickly even in sub-zero conditions. Ventilation was another critical factor. Too much airflow would whisk away heat, too little would fill the shelter with smoke. To solve this, hunters cut a small opening near the ceiling, just large enough for smoke to escape but small enough that the warm air, being lighter, stayed inside. The opening was often covered with a piece of hide that could be lifted or lowered depending on the wind direction. In some high-latitude sites, archaeologists have identified windcatcher shafts, narrow tunnels dug at an angle to draw fresh air in without disturbing the thermal envelope. The result was a surprisingly comfortable microclimate. Temperature measurements taken in reconstructed pit houses suggest that, even when outside temperatures dipped to -40 degrees Celsius, interior air stayed above -5, and the floor remained just a few degrees above freezing. That difference may seem small, but it's enough to keep a sleeping human from hypothermia, especially when bundled in fur garments and surrounded by a layer of hot coals. And let's not forget the social aspect. Sleeping in a communal space meant bodies shared heat, a practice still seen in many Arctic cultures today. Families would huddle together, their heads tucked under the same hide canopy, creating a human blanket that added several degrees of warmth. The elders, with their deep knowledge of shelter construction, would oversee the arrangement, ensuring that each member, especially the infants, was positioned where the heat lingered longest. So, while we might picture our ancestors huddling in flimsy caves, the archaeological record shows they engineered sophisticated, insulated dwellings that combined earth, wood, animal products, and clever ventilation. These early sleep-proof shelters weren't just shelters, they were life-saving, climate-controlled habitats that turned the brutal -40 degrees Celsius nights of the Ice Age into a manageable, if still chilly, night's rest. How did a hunter-gatherer stop a gushing wound when there was no pharmacy on the doorstep? The answer lies in the surprisingly sophisticated first aid kits that archaeologists have uncovered in caves and open-air sites across Europe and Western Asia. These kits weren't made of plastic or steel, they were bundles of stone tools, plant fibers, and animal parts, all carefully assembled in a leather or bark pouch that could be slipped into a hunter's belt. When a spear tip slipped or a broken bone punctured skin, the first priority was to staunch the bleeding. Scientists believe that people used flaked stone blades, sometimes called scrapers, to shave away damaged tissue and to cut clean edges around the wound. The sharp edge of a quartzite or flint piece could act much like a modern scalpel, and experimental archaeology has shown that such tools can make precise incisions without tearing surrounding flesh. To seal the wound, ancient people turned to natural bandages. Strips of bast from willow or oak, softened in warm water, were wrapped tightly around the injury. In some sites, we find evidence of animal sinews, strong, fibrous cords harvested from deer or bison, that were twisted into rope-like strips. These were especially valuable for deeper lacerations where a stronger hold was needed. But stopping the bleed was only half the battle. Infection loomed like an invisible predator. Here the first aid kits reveal a surprisingly keen understanding of antimicrobial resources. Charred charcoal fragments, often found tucked alongside stone tools, were rubbed onto wounds. Charcoal is porous and can absorb toxins, and modern studies confirm its ability to reduce bacterial growth. In addition, powdered birch bark, rich in betulin, and crushed yarrow leaves appear in residue analyses. Both plants contain compounds that inhibit microbes and promote clotting. When mixed with animal fat to form a greasy paste, the mixture created a barrier that kept dirt out while keeping the wound moist, a condition we now know accelerates healing. Some kits even included small pieces of amber or quartz that were likely used as spear tips for probing and cleaning the wound cavity, a practice reminiscent of modern surgical curettes. The presence of these items in burial contexts suggests that early humans not only valued the tools for immediate survival, but also recognized their cultural importance, perhaps even attributing a protective spirit to the pouch itself. So, while the term first aid kit feels modern, the core idea, having a ready-to-use collection of sharp stones, absorbent fibers, and natural antiseptics, was essential for anyone living on the edge of a glacier. It turned a potentially fatal injury into a survivable setback, allowing the wounded hunter to crawl back to camp, rejoin the group, and keep the fire burning through another brutal night. How could a group of people with nothing more than a stone point and a bundle of animal skins outsmart a saber-toothed cat that could weigh as much as a small horse? The answer lies not in magical weapons, but in clever use of the environment, social coordination, and a deep understanding of predator behavior, details that archaeologists and paleoanthropologists have pieced together from cave paintings, bone assemblages, and the wear patterns on ancient tools. First, Ice Age hunters knew the terrain better than any feline. In the steppe tundra of central Siberia and the open plains of North America, they chose hunting grounds near natural choke points, rocky outcrops, narrow river valleys, or dense thickets where a huge cat could not gain speed. By corralling herds of bison or mammoths into these bottlenecks, they forced the predators into predictable paths. When a saber-tooth stalked the edge of a herd, hunters would fan out in a wide circle, keeping a visual line on the cat while simultaneously driving the prey toward a preset pit or a low-lying snowdrift that could act as a natural trap. Second, they used fire as a psychological weapon. Charcoal residues and hearth fragments found alongside saber-tooth fossils show that early humans often built low, smoky rings around their camps. The smell of smoke and the flickering light confused the cat's keen night vision, making it more likely to hesitate. In some sites, researchers have found stone tools deliberately placed near fire pits, suggesting that hunters would thrust spears into the ground around the blaze, creating a barrier the cat would be reluctant to cross. Third, social organization mattered. Ethnographic analogs from modern hunter-gatherers demonstrate that coordinated drive hunts can involve 10 to 30 individuals, each assigned a role: scouts, drivers, and rear guards. Experimental archaeology with replica atlatls and spears shows that a well-timed thrust can incapacitate a predator's forelimb, especially if the hunter aims for the shoulder joint, an area where saber-toothed cats had relatively thin bone due to their elongated forearms. Finally, evidence of healed saber-tooth bite, marks on human ribs and femurs, tells us that these people survived encounters, likely because they treated wounds with natural antiseptics. Charred spruce bark, rich in resin, was scraped onto cuts. The resin's antimicrobial properties would have reduced infection, a practice inferred from residue analysis on stone scrapers. So, rather than battling a saber-tooth head-on, Ice Age hunters turned the landscape into a maze, used smoke as a deterrent, coordinated as a disciplined team, and applied early medical knowledge to stay alive. The tactics may sound like a prehistoric game of chess, but they're grounded in hard evidence: bones, tools, and fire-charred sediments that show exactly how our ancestors outwitted one of the most fearsome predators of the Ice Age. How did our Ice Age ancestors know when a wound was serious enough to treat, and what clues did the walls of their caves leave for us about those early medical practices? The answer lies not in mythic potions, but in the subtle, almost accidental details etched into the very pigments that have survived for tens of thousands of years. When researchers first examined the ochre-stained panels of Lascaux, Chauvet, and Cuva de los Manos, they expected only hunting scenes and abstract symbols. Yet a closer look revealed a pattern: repeated depictions of humans with exaggerated limbs, swollen joints, or bands of dark pigment wrapped around the torso. In the Upper Paleolithic context, these injury marks are not random. Scientists believe they are visual records of individuals who suffered fractures, arthritis, or even infectious disease. The fact that the same figure appears multiple times, sometimes with a hand raised over a wound, suggests a communal awareness of the need to protect that area, perhaps with a primitive bandage made of animal hide or plant fibers. Even more intriguing are the rare, healing motifs: tiny clusters of red and yellow spots placed near a wounded figure. Experimental archaeologists have reproduced the pigments using iron oxide ochre mixed with animal fat, a mixture that, when applied to skin, can act as a mild antiseptic. Modern microbiology confirms that iron oxide has modest antibacterial properties, so it's plausible that Paleolithic people discovered, by trial and error, that rubbing ochre on a cut reduced infection. The Cave of El Castillo in Spain provides another hint. Here, a series of abstract dots and lines appear near a depiction of a bison with a conspicuous dark patch on its flank. Some researchers argue that this could represent a skin lesion, perhaps an early observation of a parasitic infection like mange. The adjacent series of concentric circles might symbolize a ritual, cleansing, a communal effort to keep the herd healthy, which in turn would protect the human group from zoonotic disease. Beyond visual clues, the very locations of the paintings tell a story. Many artworks are placed deep within the shelter, far from the entrance where drafts are strongest. This positioning suggests that the artists wanted a dry, stable environment to preserve the pigments, but it may also have served a practical purpose: a sheltered space where the sick could rest away from the cold and from predators, while the healthy continued to hunt. Ethnographic parallels among modern hunter-gatherers show that convalescing members often stay in sick rooms, simple shelters built near the main camp but isolated enough to limit contagion. Finally, the distribution of medicinal plants in the surrounding strata offers concrete evidence of early pharmacology. Pollen analysis from layers at the site of Dolny Vestonis shows a spike in the presence of yarrow and willow bark during periods of intense painting activity. Both plants contain salicylates and anti-inflammatory compounds, and their use is documented in later Neolithic societies. The coincidence suggests that the same people who were painting their experiences with disease were also gathering these herbs to treat pain and fever. So, the caves were not just galleries of ancient art, they were living medical manuals, encoded in pigment and placement. The images of bruised limbs, the careful choice of antibacterial ochre, the strategic location of the art, and the accompanying botanical evidence together paint a picture of a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of illness and healing, one that relied on observation, trial, and a communal willingness to share knowledge long before the word doctor ever existed. How did prehistoric people keep a fire alive long enough to get through the endless winter nights of the last ice age? It sounds like magic, but the answer is plain old chemistry and clever engineering. When you look at the archaeological record, from the caves of Les Catés in the French Pyrenees to the open-air sites of the Siberian tundra, you'll find evidence that ancient hunters weren't just huddling around a single flickering flame. They built fire banks, essentially portable ember caches that could survive for weeks, sometimes months, without fresh fuel. Scientists have studied charred wood fragments and ash layers in hearth pits and discovered a consistent pattern. People would deliberately create a core of slow-burning, dense wood, usually hardwood such as oak or beech, cut into thick, flat blocks. They then arranged the pieces in a low, insulated pit, often lined with stone or packed with dry moss and animal skins. The key was to limit oxygen. By covering the ember with a layer of ash, they created a microenvironment where the heat could radiate slowly while the combustion rate dropped dramatically. The resulting, slow smolder produced a steady temperature of about 250 degrees Celsius, enough to keep the embers alive, but not so hot that they would burn through the surrounding material. Another trick involved using natural fireproof containers. In the Altai region, archaeologists have uncovered stone or bone bowls that were partially buried and filled with smoldering embers. The stone acted like a thermal mass, storing heat and releasing it gradually. When a group needed a spark, they'd retrieve a few embers with a stick, blow on them gently, and the fire would flare up again. This method saved precious tinder, which was scarce in the frozen steppe. Experimental archaeology has confirmed the technique. Modern volunteers replicate the ancient fire bank using only flint, dry tinder, and hand-split hardwood. By sealing the pit with a layer of dry leaves and snow, they can keep the ember alive for up to 30 days, even in sub-zero temperatures. The secret isn't mysticism. It's controlling airflow and using materials that retain heat. So when you hear a story about carrying fire in a bag, you can now picture a carefully prepared ember bank, a stone-lined pit, and a handful of smoldering coals that kept an Ice Age tribe warm, fed, and ready to light a new hearth when the next hunt demanded it. The science is simple, but the ingenuity is something our ancestors should be proud of.